Seth, happy Friday, buddy.
Happy Friday to you. This is becoming our little tradition here of the last thing we do before we're off the clock. So this is I like it. It's a good way to send out the week.
It is. I find out that I look forward to it. It's like the happy reward of a long week. It's like, hey man, I get to talk with Seth and we don't have to talk about work. We don't have to talk
Yes.
about anything business related.
And it's the
And
final goddamn Zoom I'm going to be on all week too, which is, a nice checkpoint.
yeah,
So,
and I want to just start off apologizing to our audience here for there may be an echo you're hearing, and there's a good reason for that. Seth, as you pointed out, I'm in an empty apartment, but I'm out of my parents' house.
again, the circumstances we've explained before, there was a reason for all of this, but yes,
Yeah,
you're now in your own pad, and
yeah,
I assume you're planning to put furniture in it. I could see you just having a lawn chair and a TV, but
yeah.
hopefully you'll get some real furniture. My fingers are crossed
Yes.
for you.
I got to tell you, one of the things moving, I've moved from many various cities, big cities, but I'm at the city closest to my parents. So they actually, I got to tell you this. So I was getting really comfortable there and they were kind of encouraging me to go out. Hey, why don't you go Friday night, meet up? And I'm like, no, I'm just going to hang out with you guys. Like, let's have you guys made dinner. I don't want to go out. I just want to stay here and
Oh
watch
no.
movies. And
And they're
so
like, dude, get out of our hair. Oh man.
I got to tell you this. So I was supposed to move, right? And I actually signed the lease. And I was like, well, why don't I just do this week here? And they woke up on Saturday and they had like stuff packed. They're like, hey, we just got this. We thought we'd do this for you. We packed up everything. And they're basically saying, like, we want you out of the
Like,
house.
get the fuck out of our house. Yeah. The party's over. Yeah.
They dropped me off and I was like, hey, well, do you want to have dinner? They're like, no, we're just going to go back,
You
And
didn't even finish your sentence. The wheels are already screeching away, right?
dude, it was funny. So thanks, Mom and Bob, for your hospitality. But here we are, and I tell you, it being near Sunset. So I live like not too far away from Sunset Boulevard, where all the great, that hair metal bands and just a lot of LA bands were here. And Seth and you and I were talking about like first impressions and the importance and significance of the debut album and how so many bands it took a while for them to start just like anything like you didn't want anyone to see your first painting your first book report anything you're doing new it's kind of like and then you
Yeah.
have some bands
Your first 30 podcasts. Yeah.
yeah
Same idea.
it's the
Yeah.
first there's a whole archive there we don't even go the bootleg tapes but
Yeah.
then you have some bands that and we'll discuss this that right off the bat they're just monster debuts and Seth, what how would you even frame this up? Like why is it so important that this debut album?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the reason that it's important is fairly obvious. It's sort of your debutante to the world. It's the first time a lot of people, short of hardcore fans who have followed you when you're playing shows, but really don't have a first album together, EPs, things like that.
Yeah,
But this is really your introduction into most people's consciousness, especially if it's a little different now with the internet where things trickle out. But I think even let's say 20 years ago and before a major label debut was the what you went from being unknown to being very known pretty
yeah,
quickly. And so that first album really had the potential to make or break your band. It had the potential to change the way the record company was going to invest in your band. It dictated who you're going to tour with, depending on the style of the music, who it
yeah,
resonated with. That's all of a sudden, you're this kind of band. We'll stick you with this other band to tour with, and their audience is your audience. So if you
yeah.
kind of miss the mark with that and you don't frame your band's story and your sound right, it can almost like put you down the wrong track before you even have a chance to develop. So it's the highest of high stakes for bands to get that debut right.
And what I hear, Seth, is that especially now with data and how fast things move, uh, it used to be that your record contract, whatever, they would give you more time to develop your sound. And it sounds as of recently, it's like, hey, hit or miss. It's a quick churn and burn. If it hits, we invest. If not, move on.
Yeah, and I would even say it's evolved beyond that, where it's you have to already be a proven hit maker before you get signed, and it's like
Yeah.
you have to independently, I've got 25,000 followers on Instagram and I've got 10 million listens on Spotify. before you sign a record deal, it's cool that you're able to build that following earlier,
Yeah.
but you almost need to prove yourself. I feel like the hit rate of signed bands is much higher because they've already proven that they have a fan base, and it's just a matter of giving them a bigger megaphone to spread that word on a major label. But it's just a different equation. There was a
Yeah.
time when it truly was like hit or miss on that first one. If you fuck it up, you don't get a second shot.
It sounds like, though, I mean, do you think that's good for just the music business in general? Not music business, just for us as fans of music. If you think about, my gosh, how many bands would have developed, or how many didn't get their traction until later, and you're deciding their future just on these early metrics.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm sure there's a sliding doors moment for a lot of
Yeah.
bands. I'm sure there's bands that maybe would have made it. I've got an example in mind that basically after their first album flop, they almost broke up, and they kind of had some songs in the chamber, released them, and it was a hit.
Mhm.
But like, I actually think the era where you can organically at your own speed, you can shape your sound, you can find your fans, you can kind of build the groundswell yourself. And I think that's pretty cool. So I think it's
Yeah.
giving more bands, especially ones who maybe have an unusual sound or approach, to find an audience over time. It doesn't need to be like your first single flop, you're done, no
Yeah.
support, no money. You don't really need that amplification as much, but I think it helps bands go from known to famous in the way that we describe it.
Yeah.
It takes that elevation. But I think it's easier to make a bit of a wave now, but it's
Yeah.
easier to become huge when you had the power of the record company sort of having your rollout for you and putting all of the energy behind making that first album really big.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it sounds like there, I don't know. And I've seen this in documentaries, and I think even Neil Young pointed this out, that there seems to be just less, I won't say trust, but long-term investment in the artist.
Yeah.
To me, it's very similar to almost like venture capital now, where, hey, you have to have a proof of model. Basically, this thing has to be up and running. It's a machine, and then we're going to amplify it, or expansion capital. You've got the streams, you got all the data. You're almost a success, and so now we're going to take you to this next level.
Yeah. Yeah.
Much
And you
different
also
play.
and you arrive on the scene as a more fully finished product
Yeah,
because they're it's like they're investing in it. Actually, the venture capital thing,
yeah,
I don't always love when we use business metaphors, but that's actually a really good one because you can't be an idea or a band that's toured, it has a sound that you got to bet on. You kind of have to be a proven commodity. Show me a concept,
yeah,
show me your users, and then I'll give you money. It's the same
yeah,
idea. Then I'll give you resources. So
yeah.
that's actually a pretty good one-to-one in this version of the story for sure.
I mean, what have you seen? I mean, like, you and I watch a lot of documentaries, and the one thing I'm always surprised, not surprised about, but I actually give a lot of credit, is a lot of these artists, when you do see their debut, that's actually the result of many years of paying their dues. It's almost the culmination of, in certain careers, like, hey, we've been doing this for 7 years, and here's our songs.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I think earlier on, I mean, the adage is sort of like you have your whole life to write your first album and
yeah,
6 months to write your second. So a lot of bands, especially like I said, back when it was before you could sort of slowly develop your own following, it was like everything went into that first one, and then you get huge really quickly, and you're rushed to write something, and often that second one, there's sort of the sophomore slump, right? It drops off very
yeah,
quickly.
oh
But I
yeah,
think the reason the first one is so good for some is that they've had so much time to hone in, to refine it, to play the songs on the road, to
yeah,
tweak them, get really comfortable with them. And the reason it sounds so fully baked is because it is.
yeah,
It's had time to get there. So
yeah.
I think that old adage rings true, and it's you've had your whole life to write your first album. It's absolutely true.
Seth, one aspect of the debut album that I thought was interesting is what happened in '91 with Dr. Dre's The Chronic, which was the seminal album, right? That started essentially G-funk or gangster rap in that West Coast style. Uh, and it was really teasing out Snoop Dogg. If you remember way back, there was the video, Ain't Nothing But a G Thing, and featuring Snoop Dogg. And they kept hyping him up, He got more kind of video time with each progression of every single. And then by the time he released Doggy Style, which is his debut album, there were lines at the time at the record stores or CD stores. And I thought that was a really unique way of setting up for that debut.
Yeah, and relatively revolutionary, right? Like Dr. Dre, people knew him from NWA. He had produced
Yep.
a lot of albums. It wasn't his debut, so he already had this credibility. And it's almost like we know this guy's going to be a star. Let's give him sort of this halo. Let's put him in music videos. Let's bring him into the public consciousness. And then
Yep.
when the album hits, it'll be like a bomb, but it'll be because people are already ready for it. And that was
Yep.
almost like before you said that, I was thinking like that was used. It was almost the same way artists use the internet now before the internet, right? It's like, how do we sort of seed people's excitement
Yep.
using an established platform, building anticipation, and then again, it was a brilliant strategy that I'm sure there were others, but I think
Oh
that's the
yeah.
best example of pre-internet building excitement for that debut album. So it was almost like a can't miss situation, right? Everybody knew it was going to be a hit, and
Yeah.
then I think it even exceeded expectations beyond that.
And it was really in those last days that I remember, or maybe 4 or 5 years later in the mid '90s, with this idea of the hype at the retail environments came in together with it too. So everyone was in on like a product launch for a new artist, and I saw that with P Diddy's group at the time, Puff Daddy, with his Bad Boy records with Mace. And so they put him on the videos. They give him maybe a couple lines, then more lines, and then here comes the big launch. And so,
Yeah.
really, we got to give Dr. Dre credit in that model was insanely successful.
Yeah, it's like features were the debutante ball of hip
Yeah,
hop artists
yeah,
before EPs or anything like the equivalent of that for a rock band. It's so true actually, and it's
yeah,
again I never thought of it as like a savvy marketing move. I thought of
yeah.
it as just like, oh, these are my guys and their
Mhm.
album's not ready yet, but actually it's a really great way to have someone be a household name
Yeah,
before, especially if you believe that when their album does drop, it's going to be a hit. Like they had to have
yeah,
some sense that we've got something in the oven here. And when it comes out in 3 months, you're going to love it. So let's make sure we feature this guy so people are ready for him. Yeah.
definitely. I really got to give that credit because it's in such a savvy move if you think about the hype that it built. Now I don't know if it's that effective. It's just because I think they're much more faster on releasing, on getting data, as you mentioned, and releasing songs and getting some type of base before you have a full 10, full LP, so to
Yeah.
speak.
A more
Uh,
modern example is like, a modern internet example for me is like Billie Eilish. I really
yeah,
remember a friend of mine. Like, have you heard of this girl? She's like
yeah,
15 and she had like 3 songs out and they were just super viral. And people just kind of knew about her. So by the time she I remember when I heard the song on the radio, I was like, oh, this
yeah,
is the girl that my buddy John talked about like a year and a half ago. So
yeah,
it's like people can't sneak up on you anymore in
yeah.
the way that they used to be able to, right?
No, not at all. Not at all. I think that those days are gone where you have no idea who they are, and then all of a sudden they're blasted with this debut first album.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the past you had local, here in LA, right? The Doors are a good example. They were a highly regional band to Southern California, uh, and advertised locally and played there with a house band essentially at the Whiskey, and then had a debut album that was first a hit in California and then spreads.
Just
Uh,
grew. Yeah.
yeah.
I was going to say, that's an example of sort of organic growth, for lack of a better way to say it, where
Mhm.
something comes out, is popular, but sort of builds a slow groundswell. I think some of the ones we're going to talk about are ones that just like boom from 0 to 100 right away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's get into that. So let's go to the best, the ones roaring out of the gates, home
Yes.
runs,
Okay.
massive.
So I've got a bunch here, but the one I
Okay.
think is the most insane example of from nobodies to crazy huge is the debut Boston album, Boston, the self-titled.
Yeah.
That's an album that has 8 songs on it. I'm not kidding. I went through before we get on every single one of those 8 songs from More Than a Feeling all the way down to like Something About You, which wasn't that famous. those songs still get played on classic rock radio
Yeah.
today. All 8 songs.
Yeah.
And then I think they maybe had like 2 other hits. Don't Look Back was on the second album,
Yeah.
but that was 8 for 8 right out of the gate. No skippers. It's fucking insane how big that album was. It deserves that credit.
And I heard they were the first band to ever, I think, sell out the Madison Square Garden, their first ever time playing.
Yeah,
like,
I believe it.
Yeah, it was like this 3 days, 3 nights. Never had played there. They went from like 0 to like New York, packed, sold out.
Yeah, they were playing in a basement in like Millis or something. Yeah. You know, they were a random suburban band that they just had 8 absolute classic songs that that all came at once.
Some of the other huge, Whitney Houston's debut album from 1984, Whitney Houston, enormous. You can see that album cover everywhere. That was one that was a landmark, breaking all the records in terms of album sales and whatnot. One that, again, recently here down the street, Appetite for Destruction.
Absolutely. That was on my list too. I mean, that's a band, again, that probably had some credibility in LA. They had been around, playing down the street from you, probably on the Sunset Strip. Yeah. But when that album came out, it was like an edgier version of the hair metal that was out there. It was still kind of in that genre. It wasn't wasn't grunge, different, but it was, again, just like went from them being unknowns outside of one little music community to being super duper stars, and that had 5 hits on it or something. And that I think for a lot of people, not to knock, Use Your Illusion and all that stuff, like they did their albums. Won't talk about Chinese Democracy, but I mean, for some people,
we did talk about that.
That's true. We hit that on a prior podcast. But for a lot of people, Appetite for Destruction is functionally a greatest hits album, right? Yeah. If you have that, you kind of have the definitive Guns N' Roses collection. I mean, not everybody, real fans like other stuff, but for the common non-Guns N' Roses fan, that is a greatest hits.
It's really true. When I saw my friends' collections, they didn't really have, maybe some would have Use Your Illusion 1 or 2. Remember, it was like a double album, very, very decadent. But that's decadent. To me, I think in terms of, we even talked about typography and iconography, it's just like, this is what everyone will say what Guns N' Roses is. This is the logo. Here are the songs. Here's what everyone wants to hear at the concert. Like a true debut. This is it. Like them in Boston, 2 albums, they're done.
Fully formed. And again, both of them iconography, with Boston, the big UFO on the front, which popped up on like every album they had. Yes. You had Guns N' Roses with the cross and the kind of the cartoon heads. I mean, that's on t-shirts today. Like that is how when people envision Guns N' Roses, they're picturing either Axl doing the weird snake dance thing, or they're picturing the cover of that album. And that's amazing to have out of the chute when literally nobody's ever heard of you. And then 3 months later, you're the biggest band in the world. It's crazy.
Huge. I thought the ultimate, though, in terms of its, I don't know what the ratio would be, impact per song per time on the market, is Sex Pistols. Never mind the Bollocks.
Yeah.
Debut album and last album. I don't know what you would even call it. They're first and last.
Grand opening, grand closing. I was going to say, they're a rare one on this list where it's just literally one and done. I mean, that's unusual, because there are a lot of bands that put out one album and break up or don't exist anymore, but it's usually because the first album sucks. So they were revolutionaries in a lot of ways, and that was one of them. Do one, break up. And I think so much of them now, is we talk about, again, iconography, and just like they were as much about all the non-music stuff, stylistically, the general, like they're most influential. Those songs are great, but they're most influential for kind of the all of the bands they influence stylistically, visually. It kind of, that was a paradigm shift, and so their job was sort of done. But it's incredible that they're still a hugely influential band today, and they had like 10 songs. It's crazy.
No, it's really an interesting way that their work was done. Like, what more? That's what I'm saying. It's the most, I would say, efficient and effective music, like production product. We're going to define the music, the beat, the tempo, the look, the language, the way they talk, the way they tour. Literally, it was let's say the Bible of punk. And
Yeah.
then they're like, I'm so happy they didn't do a follow up, because
Yeah.
if you look at so many of those that have that hype debut, the next one, even they just there's no way that Guns N' Roses could top that debut album. Or we saw with Boston as well. So it's like, hey man, it's like a movie. Just do no sequels. Just do
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Totally. And I mean, I think we've seen now with Johnny Rotten, aka John Lydon, like the longer you stay around, the shittier you get. And
Oh
so
yeah.
imagine the music following that same trajectory. But yeah, no, that's actually an incredible example.
Yeah, and we
Yeah.
already know that Jim Morrison would have become the worst now on Twitter.
Oh yeah.
He would be doing about
The worst.
crypto. He'd be sponsoring crypto ads.
He'd be 350 pounds, no question. But yeah.
New Vitamix ads.
Yeah.
Now going towards, let's say, some that maybe weren't bad, but so different from what they turned out to be
Yeah.
in their
Yeah.
trajectory of start to finish.
Yeah. There's a few that I saw where it's almost like I'm really glad. Like the way I think about it is I'm glad someone believed in them enough to give them a
Yeah,
second chance or saw talent. Like I think in the same way, this idea of you have your whole life to write the first album and that's why it's
yeah,
so good. I think when it doesn't work, it's often like an artist that very evidently has raw talent, but sort of hasn't figured out their voice, their look, their sound. And some that can come from a couple places. It's also possible that once they get signed, the record label was exerting too much control over their sound and their look.
yeah,
We're going to put you with this producer. Sometimes it's a result of having too little control, where it's
yeah,
I know what one of the ones we're going to talk about was kind of allowed to produce it themselves, and it's kind of like, dude, you needed another voice in the room. And you can often see like the seeds of what that band will become. Like,
yeah,
oh, this song is pretty good and kind of is indicative of what we heard on the second and third album.
yeah,
But it's just the magic isn't quite there yet.
yeah,
And then the second or third album is the one that breaks them. But that's there's a reason there's only a few examples here, because a lot
yeah,
of times those bands don't get a second chance. So
yeah.
what are some of the bands of that you have on your
I
list, Scott?
thought the one that was David Bowie's in 1967, just David Bowie, where he even admits like he was still trying to figure it out. So you hear that again, some raw talent in some of the music, but you can see that it's almost like he wasn't comfortable
Yeah.
in his own skin. And I mean, it's understandable. That's why I would say it's your first time. I think maybe it's just he needed more time to develop the sound and then launch it.
Especially
So
with someone who has such a unique sound, right? And a unique
exactly.
ability to change. Like it was almost his most, you can even see it by his picture on the album cover. It's the
Yeah,
most straightforward thing he ever did and the
exactly.
least interesting. And I think he realized like, I need to evolve. I need to be a
Yeah,
chameleon. And you can see why that was sort of a one and done and didn't quite resonate with people
yeah.
because it didn't have the bombast that it became very famous for, right?
I think
So
another one that you saw glimpses, but they changed it was Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden, 1980. This is this new wave of English heavy metal, and they had a previous singer who was more of a punk style. So it was this really, I won't say confusing album, but it's like, okay, there's the double guitar, that classic metal sound, but then with
yeah,
the punk energy, which I think most people would, excuse me, there, would say it's not really Iron Maiden, right? No one would say, oh, they're a punk, but actually their sound was fast, it was hard. And if you didn't see their faces and all the, Eddie and whatnot, the fonts, you may say, oh, this is an interesting punk band.
yeah.
So I
And
thought
I
that was one that it just said, oh wow, they really started here and went here.
Yeah. And I think if you think about their sound, it's Bruce Dickinson's voice, right?
Yeah,
It's that really high, it's almost like
opera.
yeah, like opera. It's falsetto and it's powerful, and that's such a cornerstone of their sound. So if it's
Yeah,
someone else, it's like you said, if it's not him singing, it's not Iron Maiden. And
yeah,
that's probably what that first album
yeah.
sounded like. So another one I wanted to pull out of this
Tell
category,
me.
someone I feel like we talk about a lot on this podcast, but Elton John, right? His
Oh,
first album, Empty Sky.
great
So
example.
so that's 1970, I believe. This is it's not horrible, but it's just Skyline Pigeon is
Yeah.
okay. That stayed in his live sets for a long time, but it just doesn't have like again, it's almost like he and Bernie Taupin writing together. They
Yeah.
hadn't quite gelled. Like the song and the sound didn't match. It
Yeah.
didn't click until his self-title, which came out like a year or two later, had 3 or 4
Yeah.
hits on it, and then he was sort of on his way. And like that was like, there's your sound. But that
That's
first
right.
album sounds like a musician and a pair of songwriters still trying to figure out what their sound is. So
Oh, totally.
uh yeah. And you don't hear many people spin that one when you're on classic vintage vinyl night.
It is. And I think if you ask most people what Elton John's first album is, they would go to Elton John, where it's just him. And it has your song on it. 1970, I think. And that one year he relaunched, I think maybe it was 69 was Empty Pages, but it was this, I listened to it and I really wanted to like it. And it was flat. And you just don't
Yeah.
expect that from early Elton John. Even the voice, everything about the recording and everything is said, I was just like, almost like a miss.
Yeah.
Um, I
This
think,
the album was a little better, but we got to always talk about them together. Billy Joel's first album, Cold
yeah,
Spring Harbor. There's a couple good songs on it, but that's
yeah,
also one that there was which I think we talked about
yeah,
before. This was almost an unforced error where the colossal fuck up was it was
yeah,
mastered too fast. So
yeah,
he almost sounds like on the original pressing, sounds like a chipmunk singing, and
yeah.
it's like this is talk about blowing your
Oh,
first shot. That the songs were not what they became, but
yeah.
I think the real issue was actually more of a technical one. And think of that's a sliding doors moment. If people are like this is
Oh,
shit,
yeah.
never gets another chance. I mean, it's crazy to think about.
Think about that if we would have never had Billy Joel.
Yeah,
One that I thought was interesting, we go back to my favorite band of all time, right? Steely Dan. But their 1972 debut album, Can't Buy a Thrill, had Donald Fagen on vocals, and it had another singer who sang like a famous song called Dirty Work. And you could really see that it was two styles. Like it was, they were choosing. And then the next album, Countdown to Ecstasy, they got rid of that singer and they just stayed with obviously Donald Fagen, who was him and Becker, the leader of this band. The songs had the hit songs on them. It's actually a really good debut album, but it
it's the
just, I was going to say
yeah.
for
Can't Buy a
Steely
Thrill has the
Dan,
songs. Yeah,
it's I'd say this, they're such perfectionists. They're notorious for their perfectionism, but like it's like kind of this big air, right? You have this like singer. It's almost like they want to go back and take his songs off.
yeah. But ironically, those first couple songs are the songs most likely to be heard in a CVS. You know what I mean? Like they're weirdly the ones that are the most pop and the most not even the most enduring per se, but
Yeah,
probably the most mainstream, but the ones that sound the least like Steely Dan. Like if
exactly.
for whatever reason you could get a person who liked Steely Dan but had never heard the first record and you played it for them, they'd be like, this is not the same band. Like they totally went into a more precise jazz influenced creative direction, and these songs were pop songs. So yeah.
It's actually a really good point. They on Sopranos, that famous gangster show on HBO.
Oh,
There's a
that one.
famous scene, yeah, Sopranos, everyone, where Tony Soprano's singing "Dirty Work," and I can imagine Becker and Fagan like saying, "Oh my God, okay, this is what people think of Steely Dan. It's not even us singing it." So,
They probably
but
didn't mind the royalty check though.
I will say though, here's a little tidbit. All right, I'm going to add something in here. There's a scathing song about John Lennon on it called "Only a Fool Would Say That," and I just dare you to listen to the lyrics. No one really knows this, but it's the one of the biggest diss songs against a Beatle by a non-Beatle.
By a non-Beatle, yeah.
Yeah,
Non-Beatle
yeah.
category.
Yeah,
Yeah.
non-Beatle category. Anyway, so Seth, going to like the worst. All right, this is the most fun. We'll wrap this up. The worst debut ever.
For me,
Yeah. Like, what do you
uh
think some of the worst ones are?
the one that I listened to before this podcast, and it's heartbreaking to say, but there's a reason for it, is Prince's first album. It's called For You. It's like a disco record, basically. He
Yeah.
produced it himself. He was 19. He very evidently had no idea what the fuck he was doing. And I'm not clear why he was given so much rope to do it. Because then by the second album, he kind of had it figured out. But this is one that just, and I don't know if I'd call it worst debut album ever. That's not fair. But
Yeah.
one of the worst for an artist that later became very famous. It's pretty resonant. It hits, you're just like, this is not good. Like for a guy that had so many good songs, it's just not good. So yeah, that's mine, I would say. How about yours?
This is a good one. Um, I actually thought Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures. Uh,
Ooh, steamy
what
take. I had that on my good list, and you have it on your bad list, huh?
I know, I'd say art wise, right? This is every hipster like this is the Bible shot. This is the you have to. There, you can't
Including
be
you, by
any
the
more
way.
colorful.
Including you. I've seen you
I
wear that T-shirt more times
yeah,
than
yeah,
I've.
I know. I
Yeah.
listen. I'm a huge Joy Division fan. I just thought their debut. Uh, I don't know. Just I wanted to like it for so many reasons, and they didn't have that many albums, right? It
Yeah.
wasn't like they had like a
There's
whole
like two or
catalog.
three, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I just thought it was. I know this is sacrilegious to say. I just didn't think it was that great. All
Me
right.
lighting up Reddit with that take. For all
It is. I mean, it
for
has
Z
like
side
people that
stories subthread.
I got to tell you, I'm sorry, everyone. Like, yeah, love the band, like, love the artwork, love the whole vibe. I just didn't think it was about it. I thought their
Not for you.
other stuff was much better, especially I won't. They're obviously a different band than New Order, but I thought some parts of that just got much better. Hey,
Yeah,
everyone's got an opinion.
totally.
That's
They're
it. That's it.
they're like assholes. Everybody's got one, right? Yeah.
But let me ask you one final question here.
Yeah.
Which band do you think is so embarrassed about their debut album that they wouldn't want you to know?
Oh, I'm trying to think. And I feel like there's some bands that have come out and said it where they're like, even if it sold well or made it popular, like, oh, what's a good example of like they're like, we don't even like playing songs off of it, but beat they're popular. I don't know. I'm gonna take a
Uh,
rain check on that one. Do you have an
okay, no,
example?
no
Because
problem. I would say this. Let me revise that question for you, buddy. Previous bands that they were in.
oh, actually, okay, so this
Okay,
is
so it's like debut. They they're a different personality per se, but it was their first time in public, like with
yeah, yeah, yeah.
published
So
material, right?
well, it's I'll give a fun one to dive into, something we already talked about. So before Billy Joel put out Cold Spring Harbor, he was part of a band called Attila. And this
Oh,
was like a hard rock band. It was him and another dude. They were wearing like the album cover's crazy. They're wearing like full like Mongolian Hun outfits. And the band's called Attila. He's unrecognizable, but he played keyboard in that band, and it's like I'm sure. I think at this point he's so rich and famous that he
yeah.
kind of doesn't give a shit. But it is so not what you picture him as. It ain't the Piano Man, but it's wild to see. So that would be mine. How about yours?
I have to say it's Dr. Dre actually. And
Oh
if you
yeah,
bought
yeah,
the Eazy-E, who was his partner for many years in NWA, and then they had this acrimonious split. And then Dre released The Chronic and has a lot of diss songs about Eazy-E. And then Eazy-E relaunches his solo album. And on the album, and the inside cover, right on CD, there's Dr. Dre's previous band called The Wrecking Crew. And Easy just literally hassles him like a PowerPoint presentation. He circles like areas and he's like, look at this. And
yeah.
Dr. Dre is in sequence with makeup, this
Yeah,
almost like drag style.
yeah, they would wear. Well, he dresses a literal doctor with like a mask,
Yeah.
and he'd have like scrubs, but they were like satin scrubs, and he would like pop and lock. It was. I mean, it was a different time, to be fair to him,
Yeah.
but for a guy who kind of ended up revolutionizing more like traditional like gangster rap.
Yeah.
It's pretty indicting, or it's a pretty big indictment of that.
that,
Yeah,
that was the one I just go, oh man, he does not want to. You don't want keep that one in the deep, deep archives. Don't let
yeah,
anyone see that. Well, Seth, listen, man, I know it's been an adventure on this podcast here. Everyone, thank you. Again, now we're literally, I won't say bi-coastal, but we're covering more ground here, Seth, now.
yes. We're
Um,
tri-coastal. I'm on the third coast on the Great Lakes,
That's
so close
right.
enough.
That's right. Well,
But
listen, hey, everyone, have a fantastic weekend. Again, tell us what your favorite or one you don't like favorite debut album is. Any artwork associated, anything with that, and let us know. And we look forward to hearing from you. And we're going to come back next week with a very big announcement about a very, very big new summit that we're going to do. And we're going to give you more details next week. So hang tight, everyone. Seth, it's Friday, buddy. Hopefully, I mean, I can't complain. You see the palm trees, everyone?
spectacular, spectacular. I'm about to bundle up and go out. But yes, and I promise the announcement next week is not my debut album. That is a promise to everybody. So,
Hey, he's not going solo. This is not featuring Seth.
no, this is not.
All
All
right,
right,
everyone. Listen, have a good weekend, buddies.
signing off. See you, man.
Yeah, bye bye.